So in the previous video, we looked at how the this keyword works in JavaScript. Every function gets the this keyword automatically, and the way it works is that anytime a function is invoked, the keyword points to the current execution context. So its value will depend upon the way the function was invoked. This is also the reason why sometimes you may lose the reference to the this keyword. Just take a look at this example. So we have a class here with a constructor function and a method. This method basically prints the name of the person after 2 seconds. So we are using the setTimeout function, which is going to have a callback function, and this callback function will print the first name and the last name after 2 seconds. So when I try to create an instance of this class and run the method on this instance, ideally I should get the first name and the last name, right? But when I run the method, I get undefined for both the first name and the last name. Now the reason why this is happening is because the console log statement is actually not part of the method here. It's part of the callback function. So the callback function is going to have its own this value, and this dot first name and this dot last name will use the this reference of this callback function and not the method. This is what I meant when I said that we sometimes lose the reference to the this keyword. So we assume that the this keyword here is going to be the class instance, but it's not. It's going to be the window object in this case. You can even check by console logging the this keyword here, and if I go back to the browser, I should see the window object and then the first name and last name. So if you have watched my previous video, you would have already guessed that one way to solve this issue is to use the arrow function. So when I use the arrow function here, it's going to fetch the this keyword from the parent scope. So in this case, the callback function will look at its parent scope, which is the method. And for the method here, this keyword is pointing to the class instance. So whenever I create the class instance here, person, this keyword is going to be this person object, the class instance. So I can actually prove this by just console logging the this keyword here. So now this console log statement is part of this print method, and this console log statement is part of this callback function. For now it's going to print the same thing because I'm using the arrow function here. So if I save this and go back to my browser, you can see that I'm getting the person object first for this console log statement. So the method's this keyword is pointing to the person object, and inside the setTimeout, the arrow function is now going to look for the this keyword inside the method, inside its parent scope. So again we are getting the same person object, and then we are getting the actual string, the first name and the last name. If I would have converted this back to a regular function, I would have again got the original undefined value. So I get the person object first, then I get the window object, and I get undefined for both first name and last name. So yeah, this is one way of solving the problem, but it's obviously not the only way to fix it. In fact, JavaScript has a few dedicated methods that let you switch between contexts. They are the call, apply, and bind methods present on the function prototype, and we'll start off by looking at the call method. The call method is actually pretty straightforward. So say you have two classes with their own set of properties and methods. The first class has a method that the second class wants to use. So we have the car class and the bike class here, and the car class has the start method which the bike class wants to use. Instead of writing it again inside the bike class, we can just use the call method. Now, in order to use this start method inside the bike instance, we first have created this bike instance over here, and we are using the same method now. So as I had mentioned earlier, call method is part of the function prototype, so it's going to run on functions. So bmw.start here is a function. bmw.start will have the call method. So we are using the call method on bmw.start, and we are passing in the bike instance here. So the bike instance that we have created over here is now being passed inside this call method. So the call method basically takes a set of arguments, and the first argument is always going to be the context or the object for which you want to call the method. So in this case, the first argument is going to be the bike instance, which is this Honda object over here. And the second parameter that you see here is a set of arguments. We'll look at the arguments part later, but first let's just go through this. So if I now run this and go back to my browser, I can see that the first console log statement is for the car instance, and the second console log is for the bike instance. So even though the bike class didn't really have any start method, it still executed this method here from the car instance, from the car class, because we use the call function on this start method and pass the context as our bike instance. Now if the method has some arguments, we can still use the call function by just adding the arguments after the first parameter here. So the first parameter was always going to be the context or the object. Now if the start method has any arguments, it's going to be appended inside this call function after the context. So we can take a look at that by just simply adding a time argument inside the start method, and I could just add new date here for the first console log, and inside Honda I can again do the same thing. Instead of just using the new date, I'll just try to convert it into a date string. I also need to use the time somewhere in this string, so I'll just add one more thing. Yeah, and now you can see that we get both the console log statements for the car instance and the bike instance. And the way we do it inside a call function is by just passing any set of arguments after the context, after the object instance. So essentially the call function allows for a method belonging to one object to be assigned and called for a different object. It just provides a new value of this to the function or the method, which in turn lets you reuse the function. You can use call on normal functions as well. It does not have to be just methods inside a class. Now once you know how call works, you'll automatically understand apply as well. Apply essentially does the same thing as call, but the arguments that you would have passed individually in case of call will now be passed in an array. So we have this argument over here. Now if we are using apply instead of call, you won't be passing this argument as it is. All you need to do is just change this argument into an array of arguments. If I replace this with apply now and just try to run this again, I get the same output. So the only fundamental difference between call and apply is the way you pass arguments inside the function. So in case of call, it's going to be individual arguments after the object instance, and in case of apply, it's going to be an array of arguments. Okay, so now the final one, which is the bind method, again is very identical to these two. It's again more or less the same method, but the key difference here is that while call would immediately run the function with a new value of this, bind will attach this to the function and return it. It won't run it, it will just return the whole function with a new binding of this. So instead of apply here, just for the sake of this example, I am replacing it with bind. And now what will happen is this line won't run the method. Previously you would see two console log statements here, but now you can see that there's only one. So this is the method that first got executed, but this line won't really run the method. It's returning something. What it's returning is the actual function that was supposed to run, but now this function is going to have the instance attached to it, the Honda instance. So now this is going to return the function with the bound instance, so I can actually store it in a variable. So let func be the instance that gets returned from this bind method. So now this func is going to have the whole start method here, but this instance is now fixed to the Honda object because I've used the bind method. So it binds the Honda object instance to this start method and then returns a new function. This new function is now going to be stored inside this variable. So this specific function will always return the method, the start method, with this value referring to the Honda object instance. We can actually also fix the very first example using the bind method. So if I just bring back the first example, here we were getting undefined for both first name and last name because the value of this was pointing to the window object and not the person instance. This can be fixed with the bind method. So if I just use the bind method on this callback function here, and the value of context is going to be this. I explain what I'm doing here, but let's first take a look at the result. So after 2 seconds I do get the value correctly. I get the first name and the last name. So the reason why this works is because as I had already mentioned, inside the function the value of this is going to be different. So this callback function will have a this pointing to the window object. We had already looked at this earlier. But the moment you are out of this function, so the moment you are inside this scope, here or maybe here, the value of this now points back to the class instance. So the person object that you create, over here this value is going to point to this person instance. That's because once you are out of the anonymous function, you are now again part of this print name method. So anywhere outside this function, even over here, the value of this is going to be pointing to the class instance. Anywhere outside this anonymous function. So here the value of this is going to be the class instance. Inside here it's going to be class instance. Also over here it's going to be the class instance. So when I try to bind the class instance to this callback function, it's obviously going to give me the person as the value of this. But yeah, that's pretty much it actually. If you understand how this keyword works, these three methods would make perfect sense to you. You use them to reuse functions and methods or to manually set a function context. Because at times, especially in the case of nested functions, as you've already seen over here, there's a function inside which you have a function. You pretty much always lose this keyword. At that point, these methods come in handy. Yeah, I recommend you to watch this video as well as the previous one multiple times to get a proper grip on these topics. These are very important concepts that will help you write more meaningful and efficient code in the future. So yeah, do watch them carefully. And if you have any doubts or suggestions, you can put them in the comments. Yeah, I'll see you in the next one.